The sound of laughter still echoes in my mind. Not the kind of laughter you share with friends over coffee. No, this was the cruel, cutting laughter that follows you into sleepless nights. The kind that makes you question everything you are, everything you fought for. They looked at me and saw nothing. A girl barely 5'4" in combat boots that seemed too big. A voice too soft for the barracks. Hands too small to matter in a world built for giants. At family dinners, they'd pat my head like I was still 12. At military events, they'd ask if I was someone's daughter visiting for the day. But here's what they didn't know. What they couldn't see behind the smile I wore like armor. Behind the quiet, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," that kept me invisible. I was about to become the most decorated female soldier in my unit's history, and they were all about to find out at the worst possible moment for them. My name is Sarah Chen, and for 26 years, I've been a ghost in my own life. Growing up in a military family in San Antonio, Texas, I was surrounded by giants. My father, Colonel James Chen, stood 6'2" with shoulders that could carry the weight of the world. My older brother Marcus made quarterback look easy, with biceps that strained against his dress blues. Even my mother, though she'd never served, carried herself with the commanding presence of someone who'd managed a household of warriors. And then, there was me. Little Sarah, they'd call me, ruffling my hair even when I was 25 and wearing lieutenant bars. Our tiny warrior. The words always came with a smile, but underneath, I heard what they really meant. You're not quite enough. When I enlisted in the Army at 18, the comments started immediately. Drill sergeants would look at me and shake their heads. "Chen, you sure you're in the right place?" The Girl Scouts meet down the street. The other recruits would snicker, already dismissing me before I'd even had a chance to prove myself. But I had something they didn't see. Something that had been burning inside me since I was 7 years old. Watching my father in his dress uniform, knowing that I wanted to serve my country with the same honor, the same dedication. I had fire. Basic training was hell, but I survived. More than survived. I excelled. My PT scores were perfect. My marksmanship was flawless. My tactical knowledge was razor sharp. But somehow, none of that mattered. I was still just little Sarah, the girl who looked like she belonged in a college dorm, not a combat zone. The worst part wasn't the strangers who underestimated me. It was my own family. 3 years into my service, Christmas dinner 2019, the dining room was filled with the usual suspects. Dad, in his perfectly pressed civilian clothes that still somehow looked military. Mom fussing over the turkey. Marcus home on leave from his deployment in Germany. And me sitting quietly at the kids' table. Literally. My teenage cousins had been moved to the main table, but somehow I was still relegated to the folding card table in the corner. "So, Sarah," my Uncle Robert said, cutting into his prime rib with the precision of a surgeon. "Still playing soldier?" Playing soldier. The words hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. "Yes, sir. Still serving." "That's nice, honey," Aunt Linda chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "It must be like summer camp for girls now, right? I'm sure they keep you safe in the office somewhere." Marcus laughed, actually laughed at his aunt's comment. "Sarah's not exactly frontline material, are you, sis? She probably spends her days filing paperwork and making coffee for the real soldiers." If only you knew, I thought, remembering the classified mission reports that crossed my desk daily, the commendations locked away in my personal file, the operations I couldn't talk about even if I wanted to. "Marcus," Dad said, but his tone was more amused than corrective. "Give your sister some credit. I'm sure she's contributing in her own way." Contributing in my own way. I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The same heart-shaped face that had always made me look younger than my years. The same delicate features that made people think I'd break at the first sign of trouble. The same 5'4" frame that made me invisible in a room full of warriors. But what they couldn't see, what they'd never bothered to look for, were the calluses on my hands from rappelling down mountainsides in Afghanistan. The small scar on my temple from shrapnel during a convoy attack that I'd never mentioned at family dinners. The steady hands that had performed field surgery on a wounded Marine under enemy fire. What they couldn't see was the Medal of Valor sitting in a classified file, waiting for the right moment to be announced. 2 years later at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the pattern continued. "Chen, you're with logistics today," Captain Morrison announced during morning briefing, barely glancing in my direction. We need someone to coordinate supply runs. Supply runs. While my male counterparts were assigned to tactical operations, reconnaissance missions, and combat training exercises, I was being sent to count inventory and manage paperwork. It wasn't the first time. Despite my qualifications, despite my perfect record, despite the classified operations I'd successfully completed in 3 different combat zones, I was consistently overlooked for meaningful assignments. "Sir," I said, my voice steady despite the frustration building in my chest, "I believe there's been a mistake. I'm qualified for the tactical exercise and my clearance level—" "Chen," Captain Morrison cut me off, his voice sharp with irritation. "I've made my decision. Logistics. Now." The snickers from my fellow soldiers were like knives. I could feel their eyes on me as I gathered my gear, their unspoken thoughts echoing in the silence. Know your place, little girl. But what Captain Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd just been hand-selected by the Pentagon for a joint operation with Special Forces. What they didn't know was that in 6 months, everything would change. What they didn't know was that the quiet, overlooked Lieutenant Chen was about to become Captain Chen, and the promotion ceremony was going to be a very public affair. May 15th, 2022. The call that changed everything. "Lieutenant Chen?" The voice on the other end of the phone was crisp, official. "This is Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Pentagon. I have some news that might interest you." I was sitting in my small apartment off base, still in my ACUs from the day's training, eating leftover Chinese takeout, and wondering if I'd made a mistake choosing a career where I seemed destined to remain invisible. "Yes, ma'am? Your promotion to captain has been approved, effective immediately. Additionally, you've been selected to receive the Distinguished Service Cross for your actions during Operation Silent Thunder in Afghanistan." My chopsticks clattered to the floor. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. The operation she was referring to was so classified that I'd never been able to mention it to anyone, not even my family. "Ma'am, Thank you, ma'am. The ceremony will be held at Fort Bragg in 2 weeks. You're authorized to invite family and friends. Lieutenant Chen," her voice softened slightly, "I've read your file. All of it. Your country owes you a debt of gratitude." After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour. Then I reached for my phone and started making calls. "Dad, it's Sarah. I'm having a promotion ceremony in 2 weeks. I'd like you and the family to attend." "Of course, sweetheart." "Captain, huh? That's wonderful. We'll all be there. If only you knew what you're really going to witness." 2 weeks later, the base was buzzing with activity as families arrived for the ceremony. I watched from my barracks window as my relatives piled out of rental cars, looking slightly out of place in their civilian clothes among the military personnel bustling around the parade grounds. My stomach was a knot of nerves and anticipation. This wasn't just a promotion ceremony. It was the moment when years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed would finally come to an end. I'd requested that the details of the ceremony be kept minimal in the invitation. My family thought they were coming to watch me receive my captain's bars. They had no idea what else was waiting. "Sarah!" Mom's voice carried across the parking lot as I made my way to the ceremonial hall. She was wearing her best dress, the one she saved for special occasions, and her face was beaming with pride. "We're so proud of you, honey." Dad stood beside her in his dress blues, looking every inch the distinguished colonel he was. Marcus was there too, along with Uncle Robert, Aunt Linda, and a handful of cousins who'd made the trip. Even some of my former classmates from high school had shown up after hearing about the ceremony through social media, but it was the group of people I didn't recognize that caught my attention. Men and women in dress uniforms with more ribbons and stars than I could count. High-ranking officers who'd traveled from Washington, Norfolk, and other bases around the country. "This is bigger than they think." "Sarah, sweetheart," Dad said, pulling me into a hug. "I have to admit, I'm surprised by the turnout. This seems like quite an elaborate ceremony for a promotion to captain." I smiled, keeping my expression neutral. "The Army likes its ceremonies, Dad." What I didn't tell him was that I'd seen the guest list. What I didn't tell him was that the Secretary of the Army was sitting in the front row. What I didn't tell him was that my former commanding officer from Afghanistan had flown in specifically for this ceremony. What I didn't tell him was that in 30 minutes, everything they thought they knew about me was going to change forever. The ceremonial hall was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. The American flag stood proudly at the front of the room, flanked by the Army flag, and the flags of various units and commands. I took my place among the other soldiers being honored that day, but I noticed I was the only one with a separate section reserved for what appeared to be very high-ranking officials. My family sat in the front rows, looking around with obvious curiosity at the elaborate setup. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ceremony began, "please rise for the national anthem." As the music played, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished floor, the same small frame that had always made me look out of place in uniform, the same youthful face that had caused so many people to underestimate me. But today, something was different. Today, I stood with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she'd accomplished. The anthem ended, and we all took our seats. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, stepped to the podium. "Today we gather to honor several outstanding soldiers," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "We'll begin with routine promotions and recognitions, and then we have a very special presentation. Very special presentation." I saw Dad lean forward in his seat, his curiosity clearly piqued. Marcus was looking around the room, probably wondering why there were so many high-ranking officers present for what he assumed was a simple promotion ceremony. The routine ceremonies proceeded quickly. Promotions, service medals, commendations. Each soldier stepped forward, received their recognition, and returned to their seat to polite applause. Then, Colonel Harrison's tone changed. "And now, we come to a presentation that is particularly meaningful to our command, and indeed to our entire army." The room fell silent. Even the whispered conversations in the back rows stopped. The actions I'm about to describe took place during Operation Silent Thunder in Afghanistan, a classified mission that, until recently, could not be publicly acknowledged. I saw my father's spine straighten. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. This operation involved the rescue of a captured Navy SEAL team behind enemy lines. The mission was complicated by severe weather conditions, heavily armed enemy forces, and terrain that made traditional extraction impossible. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The soldier I'm about to call forward not only volunteered for this mission, but took command when the original team leader was wounded. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, this soldier successfully coordinated the rescue of 6 American servicemen while under heavy enemy fire. The colonel paused, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. During the course of this mission, this soldier personally neutralized 4 enemy combatants, performed field surgery on a wounded Marine, and called in air support that prevented the entire team from being overrun. The mission was completed with 0 friendly casualties. I could see my family members turning to look at each other, confusion written across their faces. They were starting to understand that this ceremony was about more than a simple promotion. "Will Lieutenant Sarah Chen please step forward?" The sound of my name echoed through the silent hall like thunder. I stood and walked toward the front of the room, my boots clicking against the polished floor. Every eye in the room was on me, but for the first time in my life, I felt completely comfortable being the center of attention. As I passed my family's row, I could see the shock on their faces. Dad's mouth was slightly open. Marcus looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Mom had her hand pressed to her chest, and Aunt Linda looked pale as a ghost. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Harrison continued as I took my position at the front of the room, "it is my distinct honor to present Lieutenant Sarah Chen for promotion to the rank of captain." The promotion itself was a blur. The reading of orders, the removal of my old rank, the pinning of new bars. But I was acutely aware of every face in the audience, every shocked expression, every moment of dawning realization. "But that's not why we're all here today," the colonel said, his voice rising slightly. "Captain Chen, your actions during Operation Silent Thunder have earned you one of our nation's highest honors. This is it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Patricia Hayes, Secretary of the Army." The Secretary of the Army. A woman in dress blues with more stars than I could count stepped to the podium. The entire room rose to their feet in a show of respect that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Thank you. Please be seated," General Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. "I flew here today from Washington specifically to present this award, because what Captain Chen accomplished in Afghanistan represents the very best of what our army can be." She turned to face me, and in her hands was a distinctive blue ribbon with white stars, the Distinguished Service Cross. "Captain Sarah Chen," she said, her voice formal but warm. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, you are hereby awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The room erupted in applause, but all I could hear was the silence from my family's section. I turned slightly and saw Dad's face. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. Marcus looked like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. But General Hayes wasn't finished. Additionally, Captain Chen, your exemplary service record and demonstrated leadership abilities have earned you selection for a position that I believe you'll find interesting. What? Effective immediately. You are being assigned as the youngest female liaison officer to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. The Pentagon. The Joint Chiefs of Staff. The applause was deafening now, but I was barely aware of it. This wasn't just recognition. This was validation of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd endured. As General Hayes pinned the medal to my chest, she leaned close and whispered, "Your country is proud of you, Captain, and I suspect your family is about to be as well." The reception following the ceremony was a blur of handshakes and congratulations. High-ranking officers I'd only read about in military journals were seeking me out, talking about future assignments, discussing my potential for advanced command positions. But through it all, I kept one eye on my family, who were standing in a tight group near the refreshment table, looking shell-shocked. Finally, I made my way over to them. "Dad?" I said softly. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes still slightly damp. Then slowly, he came to attention and saluted me. My father, saluting me. "Permission to speak, ma'am?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes. "Granted, Colonel. I owe you an apology, Captain Chen. We all do." He gestured to the rest of the family, who were watching in stunned silence. "We looked at you and saw our little girl. We should have seen the warrior you've always been." Marcus stepped forward, and I could see that his eyes were red too. "Sarah, I had no idea. The things they said about what you did in Afghanistan. God, I can't even imagine." "The missions were classified," I said quietly. "I couldn't talk about them." "But you could have told us you were being considered for awards, for promotions," Mom said, her voice confused and hurt. I shook my head. "Would you have believed me? Any of you?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Uncle Robert, who had been notably quiet since the ceremony ended, finally spoke up. "Sarah, what I said at Christmas, about playing soldier." He couldn't finish the sentence. "It's okay, Uncle Robert," I said, and I meant it. "You saw what everyone else saw. Someone small, someone young, someone who didn't look like your idea of a soldier. But you are a soldier," Dad said firmly. "You're not just a soldier. You're one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to know, and I should have seen that years ago." 6 months later, family Christmas dinner 2022. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago, but everything else had changed. I was sitting at the head of the table now, wearing my dress blues with the Distinguished Service Cross prominently displayed among my ribbons. But more than that, the conversation had changed. Instead of dismissive comments about playing soldier, my family was asking genuine questions about my work at the Pentagon, about my experiences in Afghanistan, about my plans for the future. "So, Sarah," Uncle Robert said, cutting into his prime rib with considerably more respect than he'd shown 3 years ago, "what's it like working with the Joint Chiefs?" I smiled, thinking about the briefing I'd given to the Secretary of Defense just the week before. Challenging, rewarding, everything I hoped it would be. "Are you going to stay in D.C. permanently?" Marcus asked. He'd been different since the ceremony, treating me like the accomplished professional I was, instead of his little sister who needed protection. "For now, though there's talk of a command position opening up that might interest me." A command position. The words would have been unthinkable 3 years ago, when I was being assigned to logistics duty while my male counterparts got the meaningful assignments. "I still can't believe we didn't know," Mom said, shaking her head. "All those years, all those missions. The important thing," Dad said, raising his wine glass, "is that we know now. To Captain Sarah Chen, one of the finest officers I've ever served with, and the daughter who taught us all what real strength looks like." As everyone raised their glasses, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The years of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. The quiet endurance, the small victories that no one noticed, the gradual building of a reputation that existed in classified files and sealed records. I thought about the moment when Colonel Harrison called my name, when the truth finally came out, when years of assumptions and prejudices crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. But most of all, I thought about the lesson that had been burned into my soul through years of being invisible. Sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones nobody notices. 1 year later, Pentagon briefing room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Chief of Staff announced to the room full of senior officers, "I'd like you to meet Colonel Sarah Chen, who will be taking command of the 82nd Airborne Division." Colonel, at 28 years old. As I stood to address the room, I caught my reflection in the polished conference table. The same heart-shaped face, the same delicate features, the same small frame that had made so many people underestimate me for so long. But now, when people looked at me, they saw something different. They saw the youngest female colonel in the Army's active ranks. They saw the officer who'd been personally commended by 3 different secretaries of defense. They saw the warrior who'd proven that heroism comes in all sizes. "Thank you, sir," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm honored to accept this command." As the meeting continued, I thought about all the people who had overlooked me, dismissed me, relegated me to the background of my own life. I wondered if they ever thought about that ceremony at Fort Bragg, about the moment when everything they thought they knew turned out to be wrong. I wondered if they remembered the lesson they learned that day. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because sometimes the person you overlook is the person who's going to change everything, and sometimes the smallest soldier in the room is the one with the biggest secrets. They laughed, they mocked me, they overlooked me, but in the end, when it mattered most, they all had to salute. Because sometimes the final revelation isn't just about proving them wrong, it's about proving to yourself that you were right all along. You know what hurts the most? It's not the years of being overlooked or underestimated. It's knowing that right now, as you're listening to this, you might be going through the same thing I did. Maybe you're the one being dismissed, ignored, told you're not enough. But here's what I learned. Your moment is coming. Your final revelation is waiting. And if my story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that the quiet ones often have the loudest victories, then I need just one small favor. Almost nobody hits that subscribe button, but it's the only help I need, and it's completely free. That little red button below, it's how stories like mine reach people like you, people who need to hear that being underestimated isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning of your comeback. So please, if you felt something during these past few minutes, if you believe that everyone deserves their moment to shine, hit subscribe, because somewhere out there, someone else needs to hear that they're not alone, that their quiet strength matters, that their final revelation is worth waiting for. Your subscription doesn't cost you anything, but it means everything to someone who's still waiting for their moment to prove everyone wrong. Thank you for listening to my story. Now go write yours.